Okay, so welcome to Chapter 7. During this chapter, during the lectures associated with this chapter, what we're going to be looking at are different marine animals without a backbone. Okay, so all the animals covered here lack any kind of backbone structure. Now they're animals because A, they're multicellular, B, they're heterotrophs, meaning they eat stuff in some form or some fashion, and C, they lack cell walls. So those are the three big key features to be an animal, just to go in the animal kingdom. But now that we're in the animal kingdom, we want to explore the animals, the marine animals in particular, that lack a backbone. So whenever we talk about animals without a backbone, we use this term invertebrates. All right, so invertebrates just says you don't have a vertebrae or a backbone. Animals that have backbones, we're then going to flip and call vertebrates. Now, the crazy thing is this group makes up about 97% of all animals on Earth. They're invertebrates. So the vast majority of the animal life we see on our planet doesn't have a backbone. Yet we tend to focus primarily on the big cool stuff, that warm fuzzy stuff, or the dolphins and the whales and the sharks, which all have backbones. There's so much out there in the animal world that lacks a backbone. And that's what we want to explore here, are these animals that lack a backbone. Okay, so again, key characteristics of animals. What makes you an animal? You are, first of all, you are make sure I spell this right. You are multicellular, meaning you're made up of a bunch of cells. Without that, you might be a bacteria, you might be a protist, you might be something else. But all animals are multicellular. All animals are heterotropic, meaning they eat stuff. All animals perform aerobic respiration. And I want you guys to hopefully review aerobic respiration. What are the ingredients? What has to be there to do aerobic respiration? And then what are the outputs? What are the things released or given off from aerobic respiration? So basic biology pathway, but it's a pathway all animals are going to follow. And then the last key characteristic for animals is that they are mobile at some point of their life. They're going to move. They're going to have the ability to swim, to crawl, to jump, to fly, to have some form, some level of mobility at some point of their life. So we'll talk about all sorts of animals. Sponges, they're mobile during the reproductive portion. When they're a planula and a larva and they're moving, then they settle down. They don't go anywhere. But they move. So I said all animals are mobile at some point in their life. So, alright, so now when we're looking at general characteristics of animals, the basic body plan, what we call symmetry. This is what we want to start looking at, and looking at the similarities and differences. In an animal that has a body plan that we call radial, we will have equal parts radiate out from a central point. Okay, so you look at down on the right here, this animal down here, this little polyp structure. This is showing a radial body plan. So they radiate out from this central point. We can also look at it and say, no matter how I cut it, if I cut it straight down this way, right side is identical to the left side. If I cut it this direction, this side is identical to that side. No matter how you slice or dice up this polyp, it's always going to be a mirror image on both sides. When we get into bilateral symmetry, what we see is the organism can only be cut into right and left halves through one central plane or cut. Okay, so to get mirror images or equal right and left sides with an animal that is what we call bilateral symmetry, then we're going to see the cut can only go a certain direction, and that direction is going to be down the center here. And then the last one, this asymmetrical body plan, is you have no symmetry. The only animals associated with an asymmetrical body plan, or really lack of symmetry, are going to be the sponges. So we'll explore the sponges as we get into our animal groups here. Okay, so general features of animals, big picture stuff is what I'm looking for you guys to recognize, because when you're in the marine world, you're going to see stuff and scratch your head and wonder, geez, is that an animal? Is that a plant? Is that weird group we call the protists? Is it an algae? What makes an animal an animal? And once we're in that kingdom Animalia, we'll start breaking it down into the different phylum that we're going to see in the most influential phylum that we're going to associate in the marine ecosystem. All right, so let us start with phylum Porifera. These are your sponges. Now, Porifera, or the sponges, have certain basic characteristics. They are animals, but once you're an animal, to go into phylum Porifera, you're going to have a handful of other features. The first one is sessile. This does not move as an adult. Okay, they don't go anywhere. They attach themselves to something, some part of the reef structure, and they are not mobile as adults. That's sessile. Sponges have a thing called ostia, in which they will allow water to come in to their bodies. So there's hundreds of tiny little holes all along the body of the sponge here called an ostia, or called ostia. They're tiny little pores. That's what allows water to come in. So water goes into the sponge this way, and then water goes out the sponge through this big top opening here. And I'll show you some examples in a little bit of better images with how this works. Sponges are going to be filter feeders. Okay, so they're sessile, they're sitting there, they suck water in through these little ostia, and then the water pushes through their body wall, their tissues, their cells, they filter out the food particles, and then the water comes out the top. So filter feeding is their main mechanism. As a filter feeder, we're going to kind of call you an omnivore. You eat whatever comes into you. You're not really picky if it's algae or if it's zooplankton or whatever it is. If you can filter it out and eat it, you're going to do that. The next feature, the vast majority of sponges are marine, which is good for us with marine biology. We get to explore a lot of sponge diversity in this world. They have that asymmetrical body plan, no real true body plan. And sponges have no true tissues or organs. They lack what we consider a true tissue. They have cells. They're made up of a bunch of cells, and we'll get into those in the next slide here. But the cells don't really aggregate together to form true tissues or true organ systems or organs. So the coolest thing about sponges is, let me show you in the next slide here, is if you took this sponge or this sponge here, whatever you have, and you pushed it through a window screen, just smashed it through, all of the cells get busted apart. They get pulled apart from each other. Throw those cells into a petri dish, and they will actually come back together, re-aggregate, and reform the sponge. Now, sometimes they change jobs. They do something different. That's why we say they don't have true tissues. I can't take your arm, shove it through a screen, and have the cells that make up your skin, your bone, your muscle, your blood, etc., re-aggregate back into your arm again. Just doesn't work. But with sponges, It does. It's a very, very cool feature about sponges. So that feature also helps them when it gets into reproduction. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. So, okay, now sponge cells. What types of cells do we see associated with sponges? The first one is called the collar cell, or choanocyte. Now, collar cells are responsible for moving water into the sponge. So when we were looking back here and we were talking about the ostia, the little pores, you have all these collar cells. So here's our collar cell down here, or choanocyte. They have this little tail, or flagellum, that starts beating back and forth, creating a current, and that's what draws the water in, are those collar cells and the current that they create with their little flagella. So you see a bunch of collar cells lining up right here and over here, and all those little tails start propelling and whipping up and down, and that is going to suck water in through those little pores, or the things we call the ostia. Now the pore cells, or what we call the porocytes. The porocytes are little openings that allow the water to flow into the sponge. They're tiny little holes, or little pores. So we can see a porocyte. Let me change color. Down here, that's our porocyte cell. That's the opening. That's how the water gets into the sponge, is through that porocyte. But the current created by the collar cells is what sucks the water in through the porocyte. Spongin. Spongin is another type of cell associated with the sponge body. And the spongin will support the body wall of the sponge. Very loosely, we're going to call it the skeletal structure. It helps make up a framework, a network of tissues or of cells that give the sponge some integrity. So that way it has that structural integrity to maintain its shape. Most sponges are fairly small, but there are some barrel sponges in the deep parts of the reef that get huge. I mean, they're big enough you could stand inside of these things. 5-6 feet deep, 4 or 5 feet in diameter, huge sponges. To be able to grow that big, you need some kind of structural support, which comes primarily from spongin. And then the spicules. The spicules are going to be these little pointy structures made up of calcium carbonate, or silica. They're going to offer support and protection for the sponge. Right, that's their primary role here. So when we look, let me find you guys a spicule. And sponges have tons and tons of spicules. Let's go with blue here. Those, there it is, spicule. Those things, there's a huge variety of different shapes to spicules. Sometimes they're just straight prongs. Other times you'll see spicules that are going to be, they look like little jacks. They have all sorts of different shapes to them. But calcium carbonate, silica, integrity and strength for the sponge, the body of the sponge. All right? Now, reproduction-wise, when we look at reproduction in the sponge phylum, what we're going to see is they can do asexual budding, in which a bud breaks off to form a new one. We can see sexual reproduction, in which sponges release sperm and eggs into the water. They do a thing we call broadcast spawning. And a lot of sponges are hermaphroditic, meaning they produce both sperm and eggs, so they're both male and female, producing sperm and egg. That way they can fertilize each other and be fertilized. All right, so in our next lecture, we're going to continue to check out more